The wind in Dust Creek, Wyoming territory, did not care if it was spring. It came down from the mountains with the memory of ice, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. It whipped the dresses of the women and stung the faces of the men who gathered in the main street. It was the late 1870s, and the town was little more than a muddy road separating a line of false front buildings. Wagon wheels sank deep into the mire left by the thaw. The sound of them, a thick, sucking pull, was the heartbeat of the afternoon. It was a market day, or what passed for one. Farmers sold winter rye, trappers offered thin pelts. A man with a smoky fire turned meat on a spit, the smell of it mixing with the sour straw and the sharp tang of horse. The light was failing. It was a tired, yellow light, the kind that made everything look old and used. It caught the dust motes dancing in the air and shone on the slick mud. High on posts, lanterns were being lit. They swung in the persistent wind, their small flames tossing shadows that lurked and fled like living things. They promised shelter, but also watched like judges. Eliza May stood by her father's wagon. She was 23 years old, thin in a way that spoke of more than just lean times. Her dress was brown, mended cleanly at the cuffs. She kept her hands clasped at her waist, a habit that made her seem calm, but her calmness was a thin sheet of ice over deep water. In her eyes, which she kept lowered, lived a quiet, settled shame. She was chattel. Today, she was the thing to be sold. Her father, Tom May, stood beside her. He had once been a man who knew horses, who could gentle a wild stallion with a word and a steady hand. Now, his own hands twitched. Debt had eaten him from the inside out. His coat was worn, and his breath carried the sweet, heavy scent of whiskey he had drunk for courage. He looked at his daughter not as a father, but as a man looks at his last coin. She was his way to breathe again. Eliza felt the looks of the town. They were not glances, but heavy, probing touches. The women, mostly. They pulled their own children closer, their faces tight with a kind of grim satisfaction. They knew her story. It had been whispered over fences and in the dry goods store for a year. The word was Barren, a failure, a woman who could not do the one thing a woman was for. Her husband, a man back east, had sent her home with that word tied around her neck. And now her father, ruined by bad investments and worse luck, was here to trade her. Not for marriage, but for service, for a bond, for whatever he could get to satisfy the men who held his notes. A few children, coats too thin and faces smudged with dirt, darted between the wagons. They belonged to no one in particular, or to everyone. They were part of the landscape, like the stray dogs that snapped at their heels. Dust Creek was a place where the law was as thin as paper. A man's word was his bond, and a woman's value was measured in her hips and her ability to produce sons. The church was a day's ride east. The nearest real doctor was 2. Here, public opinion was the only law, and it was a whip. Eliza kept her gaze on her own worn boots, planted in the mud. She focused on the small sounds, the jingle of a harness bell, the sharp crack of a muleteer's whip, her father's heavy breathing. She was trying to become small, to disappear inside herself. Her goal, unspoken even in the privacy of her own heart, was simple. She just wanted to be seen, not as a womb, not as a failure, not as a debt to be paid, just as a person. A man walked past, his gaze lingering on her. He smiled, a wet, knowing smile. Eliza did not flinch, but the shame burned hotter, a red stain rising from her collar. Her father cleared his throat, shifting his weight. He was preparing his speech. Across the street, leaning against the awning post of the general store, a man watched. He was separate from the crowd. His name was Garrett Cole. He was 35, but the last 2 years had carved lines around his eyes that made him look older. He was a rancher, his spread lying a few miles out of town. He was a widower. He had lost his wife and his young son to the fever that had swept the valley. He wore his grief like he wore his coat, buttoned up tight and without show. He was a man of few words, known in the territory for being straight. His handshake was a contract. He saw Tom May, and he saw the girl. He had heard the talk. Dust Creek fed on such stories. Garrett's own home was quiet. Too quiet. His mother, herself a widow, ran the house with a harsh, unbending will. She was a woman carved from the same hard rock as the mountains. And she believed in one thing above all: blood. A name. An heir. The loss of her grandson had turned her grief into a brittle obsession. She saw the empty chairs at the table as a personal affront, a failure of the coal line. Garrett pushed himself off the post. He did not look at Eliza again, but his path took him toward the wagon. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has nowhere to be, but knows exactly what he is doing. Eliza sensed the shift in the air before she saw him. The small crowd that had been laughing by the saloon quieted. Tom May straightened his shoulders, his salesman's smile clicking into place, false and bright. "Gentlemen," Tom began, his voice too loud, trying to cover the tremor in it. "A hard spring it has been. A man needs help. A home needs a woman's hand." He put his hand on Eliza's shoulder. She felt the weight of it, the ownership in it. This was the moment, the auction of her dignity. The men looked, they appraised her. Not for beauty. She had little of that by their standards. They measured her for work. Could she cook, clean, mend, carry? And the other thing, the unspoken thing. The whispers confirmed she was useless for that. "What good is she?" Tom, a voice called out. "Coarse and mean. Heard she is empty." Laughter, sharp and cruel. Eliza closed her eyes. She felt the cold wind on her hot face. She was a broken plow, a lame horse. Her father's hand tightened, his fingers biting into her shoulder. "She is a hard worker, clean, strong. 23 years old." He was sweating now, the whiskey smell rising thick. Garrett Cole stopped a few feet away. He stood with his hands loose at his sides. His hat was pulled low, casting his face in shadow. He looked at Tom May, his gaze flat and steady. The crowd quieted again. Sensing a change, Garrett Cole was not a man who wasted time at market. He was a man of substance. His presence changed the geometry of the scene. Eliza felt the silence. She opened her eyes. She saw his boots first, solid and muddy. She looked up, past the worn trousers, past the dark coat, to his face. He was not looking at her father. He was looking at her. It was not the look of the other men. It was not appraising. It was not hungry. It was quiet. It was a look that simply saw her. It saw the shame in her eyes, and it did not turn away. The conflict was born in that moment. Her father's desperation, his need to sell her to save himself, pressed down on one side. The town's harsh judgment, its obsession with blood and heirs, pressed down on the other. And in the middle was this man's quiet, steady gaze. Tom May saw his chance. He released Eliza's shoulder and stepped forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, man-to-man tone. "Mr. Cole, a word. I find myself in a temporary bind. My girl, Eliza, she is a good girl, a hard worker, as I said." Garrett Cole did not move. His eyes stayed on Eliza. He had not come for this. He had come for seed, for salt. He had come to escape the suffocating silence of his own house, the endless, unspoken accusation in his mother's eyes. He looked at this girl, standing there like a stray calf waiting for the rope, and he saw something else. He saw a dignity that held itself intact, even in the mud, even under the weight of her father's hand and the town's scorn. Family was supposed to be a fortress. For her, it was a cage, and her father held the key. For him, family was a graveyard, a house full of ghosts and expectations he could not meet. The lantern swung, casting their nervous light. The smell of the meat on the fire was thick. A coin clinked in Tom May's pocket, a nervous, desperate sound. Each tiny noise, each shift of the wind, was building. The slow, cold pace of the afternoon was tightening, like a knot. Eliza held her breath. She did not know what was happening. She only knew that for the first time in a very, very long time, she was not invisible. She was seen. And she did not know if that was a rescue or just a different kind of cage. Tom May's desperation made him loud. He stepped in front of Garrett Cole, blocking his path, his smile wet and pleading. "Mr. Cole, a good evening to you, sir. You are a man of property, a man who understands value." Garrett's gaze remained on Eliza. He did not acknowledge her father. Tom's smile wavered. He was losing the crowd. He had to make this fast. He turned to the wagon, grabbing the rough plank that served as a makeshift tailgate, and slapped his palm on it. "She is a good girl. I say she can cook, she can clean, she can mend. She is quiet. She will not give a man trouble. My circumstances," he stammered, "force my hand. I have a debt, $50. A mere $50 for a lifetime of hard work." He fumbled in his own pocket and pulled out a few thin coins, placing them on the plank as if to start the bidding himself. $50. "Gentlemen," a man near the saloon let out a harsh laugh. $50. "Tom, for what a woman who cannot even do a woman's work. I heard she is barren. Sent back for it." The word, spoken aloud, hit the air like a rock. Barren. The crowd murmured. It was the sound of dry grass scraping pavement. It was a judgment. The women who had been watching now looked away, as if the word itself were a contagion. They pulled their children closer, shielding them from the sight of this failed, useless thing. The men grinned, enjoying the sport. "She is not useless," Tom May shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "She is strong. She—" Garrett Cole moved. He did not speak. He simply stepped past Tom May, who fell silent, his sentence hanging in the cold air. Garrett walked to the wagon tailgate. The yellow light of the swinging lantern washed over him, then left him in shadow, then washed over him again. He looked at the few coins Tom May had laid out. Then he reached inside his own heavy coat. The crowd held its breath. Eliza's heart, which had been a cold stone in her chest, suddenly gave a hard, painful beat. Garrett's hand emerged. He was holding a small, dark cloth bag, tied with a leather thong. It looked heavy. He did not open it. He did not count out coins. He simply placed it on the plank. The sound it made was not a jingle. It was a solid, definitive thud. It was the sound of an anvil. It was the sound of an ending. Tom May stared at the bag. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open. He looked from the bag to Garrett's face, then back to the bag. Garrett Cole spoke, his voice low, a rasp that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was not meant for the crowd, but the sudden silence carried it. He looked at Tom May. "That covers the debt." Tom's hand, shaking, darted out and snatched the bag. He did not need to be told twice. He backed away, his fingers already fumbling with the knot, his gaze dropping to his new prize. He had gotten what he wanted. He was free. Then Garrett Cole turned his head. He looked at Eliza. She met his gaze. She could not look away. His eyes were dark, and she saw the sadness in them. The history, but there was no pity. There was no lust. There was only a kind of quiet recognition. He spoke again, and the words were for her, only for her. "I don't need children." The world stopped. The wind died. The laughter of the men, the whispers of the women, the smell of the roasting meat, it all vanished. She heard only those 4 words. He had taken the brand that had marked her, the word that had defined her as worthless, and he had thrown it away. Then he finished, "I need you." Eliza's heart gave that second, painful lurch. Need you. Not I will take you. Not you will do. I need you. The words were a paradox. They were a chain. And they were a key. For a year, she had been a ghost, defined by an absence, an emptiness. Now, a man had looked at her and named a presence. An internal war, swift and silent, raged inside her. Was this a rescue, or just a new kind of ownership? Was she leaving her father's cage to enter this stranger's to belong, or to be possessed? She did not know. But the word need felt different. Need was not a word one used for a broken tool. Tom May, his debt paid, was already backing away, melting into the shadows of the alley by the saloon. He did not say goodbye. He did not look at his daughter one last time. The town watched. The collective body of prejudice stood silent, its judgment thick and heavy. Garrett Cole, the widower, the man who needed an heir for his land more than anyone, had just paid good money for a barren woman. The women looked at him as if he were a fool. The men looked at him with a mix of scorn and confusion. Garrett ignored them all. He did not offer Eliza his hand. He did not smile. This was not a courtship. It was a transaction, cold and sharp as the spring wind. No ring, no proposal. There was no ring, no promise, no paper. There was only the right to stay. The legal footing was mud, a void. She had no name, no status. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the street. My wagon is there. It was a statement of fact, not an invitation. Eliza understood. She took a breath. The air was cold and clean. She took one step, then another, away from the wagon where she had been sold. She left her father behind. She left her old life behind. She walked past the men at the saloon, their faces hard in the lantern light. She walked past the women, who pulled their skirts aside as she passed. She felt their eyes on her back, a physical weight. The lanterns above her swung in the wind, their light swaying, seeming to nod yes and no, yes and no. The fickle, shifting judgment of the town. She reached his wagon. It was a heavy freight wagon, the bed loaded with sacks of grain and barrels. It was a working wagon, not a carriage. He walked to the horses, his back to her, and began to untie the reins from the hitching post. He did not move to help her. He did not treat her like a lady, or like a burden. He waited, letting her make the choice to climb up herself. Eliza put her hand on the dusty sideboard. The wood was rough under her palm. She put her foot on the iron step and pulled herself up. The bench was hard wood, worn smooth. She sat, clasping her hands in her lap, her back straight. Garrett Cole finished with the horses and climbed up on the other side. A full foot of empty space sat between them. He gathered the leather reins, his movements economical and sure. He did not look at her. He clicked his tongue. The horses strained, and the wagon lurched, the heavy wheels pulling free of the mud with a thick, sucking sound. They moved down the street, past the last of the glowing lights. The sounds of the market faded. The murmurs of the crowd were lost to the wind. Eliza did not look back. She stared straight ahead, into the darkness that was gathering over the plains. The cold air bit at her face, pulling strands of her hair loose from its bun. She sat in the silence, her mind turning his words over and over, like a strange coin she did not know how to spend. I don't need children. I need you. She did not know this man. She did not know where she was going. She knew only that she had been defined by a lack, and he was the first person to see a value. She held on to those words. They were a small, hard thing in the vast, uncertain emptiness. They were a hook, and she did not know if they would pull her to safety or pull her under. But as the wagon left Dust Creek behind, she held on. The ride from Dust Creek was long. Eliza measured it in the silence. Garrett Cole did not speak. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, visible only to him in the deep twilight. The wagon jangled, the heavy wheels cutting through the dark mud. The wind was the only other voice, a high, thin sound that passed over the plains. Eliza sat on the hard bench, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She held his words in her mind. "I don't need children. I need you." They were not words of comfort. They were heavy, like the cloth bag of coins he had thrown on the plank. They were a statement of fact. She did not know what they meant. She was a woman defined by her failure, her emptiness. What could this man, this sad, quiet stranger, need from her? She was numb. The shame that had burned her face in the market town had cooled to a dull, cold ache. She felt adrift, cut loose from the only life she knew. Her father's betrayal was so complete it left no room for grief, only a vast, cold emptiness. After what must have been an hour, or perhaps 2, the wagon slowed. The land had begun to rise slightly. Ahead, Eliza saw a shape against the stars. It was not a small cabin. It was a house, 2 stories tall, built of logs as thick as a man's chest. It was dark, solid, and silent. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress against the land. A single window on the ground floor glowed with a pale, yellow light. It was the only sign of life. Garrett pulled the horses to a halt. He did not speak. He set the brake, the sound of the metal ratchet loud in the quiet. He climbed down from the wagon, his movements unhurried. He did not go to her side. He did not offer her a hand. He stood by the horses, waiting. Eliza understood. This was not a rescue where she would be carried. She would walk. She put her hand on the side of the wagon, the wood cold and rough, and climbed down. Her legs were stiff and she nearly stumbled, but she caught her balance. The ground felt alien beneath her thin shoes. "We are here," he said. He picked up a sack of flour from the wagon bed as if it were nothing and slung it over his shoulder. He walked toward the house. Eliza followed, her small bundle of possessions clutched in one hand. She felt the house watching her. The front door opened before he reached it. The light from inside spilled out, illuminating the porch. A woman stood framed in the doorway. She was tall as her son, but where he was built of broad, solid muscle, she was made of sharp angles. Her hair was a severe iron gray, pulled back from her face in a knot so tight it seemed painful. Her dress was dark, practical, and utterly without adornment. Her eyes were the same color as Garrett's, a deep, stony gray, but they held none of his quiet grief. They were bright, hard, and assessing. She looked past her son. Her gaze landed on Eliza. It was not a look of welcome. It was not a look of curiosity. It was a look of inventory. She catalogued Eliza in a single, cold glance: the cheap, worn dress, the thin body, the way she held her bundle, the shame that still clung to her like trail dust. "Mother," Garrett said. His voice was flat. "This is Eliza May." The woman did not nod. She did not say, "Welcome." Her lips thinned. She merely stepped backward, pulling the door wider. It was an invitation to enter, but it felt like a summons. Eliza stepped across the threshold. The house was not warm. The air inside smelled of lye soap, wood smoke, and something else. Something like old, dried herbs. It was suffocatingly clean. She stood in the main room. It was a large space, but the furniture was heavy and dark, seeming to drink the light. Everything was in its place. The floors were scrubbed bare. The surfaces were polished. There was no clutter. There was no sign of life. There was no joy. In the corner, by a massive stone fireplace where the embers glowed low, a single rocking chair sat. As Eliza watched, it moved, a slow, steady, backward and forward rock, though it was empty. The sound of its creaking, up, down, was the only sound in the house. It was like a memory, still telling its own story in the silence. Eliza's gaze drifted to the walls. They were bare log, scrubbed as clean as the floor. There were no pictures, no family portraits, no faded needlepoint samplers. The absence of a past was a shout. It was a house that had no memory, or perhaps a house so haunted by memory that all traces had to be erased. A long hallway stretched back from the main room into darkness. It looked impossibly long. The distance between the front door where she stood and whatever lay at the other end. Garrett set the sack of flour by the door to the kitchen. He took off his hat and hung it on a wooden peg. "I will put the wagon away," he said. He spoke to the air, not to his mother, not to Eliza. He turned and walked back out, leaving the heavy front door open. The cold spring wind blew in, swirling dust motes in the single beam of light from the lamp. Eliza was left alone with his mother. The older woman had not moved. She stood by the table, her hands clasped at her waist, a mirror image of Eliza's own nervous posture, but the mother's stance was not one of submission. It was one of judgment. "He told me he was going to Dust Creek for seed," the woman said. Her voice was as dry as the wind, as flat as the plains. Eliza's throat was tight. I did not ask to come." Her own voice was a whisper, easily swallowed by the large, cold room. The mother's eyes traveled over Eliza again, a slow, insulting appraisal from her muddy boots to her thin frame, lingering for a moment on her flat stomach. "There used to be children's voices here," she said. The words were not said with sadness. They were said with bitterness. It was an accusation. It was the first stone cast. The mother was staking her claim. This house, her eyes said, was a house of blood, of lineage. The rocking chair was for a mother. The empty walls were for the portraits of sons. This was the measure of a woman, and Eliza was a trespasser, a worthless, barren thing. Eliza flinched. The shame she had carried all day, the brand of Barren, was heating her skin once more. She wanted to turn, to run back out into the night, but there was nowhere to go. The sound of Garrett's boots on the porch cut the heavy silence. He stepped back inside, his shoulders filling the doorway. He pushed the heavy door shut. The thud of the latch sliding into place sounded terribly final. He saw the way his mother was standing, and he saw the look on Eliza's face, pale and hunted. He had brought the lamb into the wolf's den. "She will stay in the spare room," he said. He did not look at his mother, but the words were for her. At the end of the hall, "That room," his mother began, her voice rising in protest. "It is the spare room," Garrett cut her off, his voice quiet, but with an edge of steel that Eliza had not heard before. He turned his gaze to Eliza. He needed her to understand. He needed this boundary drawn, sharp and clear. "She is not a replacement." The words hit Eliza. They stung, but in a different way than his mother's. He was not rejecting her. He was protecting the memory of the one who had come before. He was drawing a line around his own grief. He respected his lost wife, in a strange, sharp way. His words also respected Eliza. He was not asking her to be a ghost. He was not asking her to fill another woman's shoes. He was acknowledging that his house was full of wounds. This was not a new beginning. It was just a continuation, a mature, hard love, or whatever this arrangement was. Had to make room for memory. "Come," he said to Eliza. She moved, grateful to escape the mother's stare. She followed his broad back down the long, dark hallway. She felt the older woman's eyes on her, a physical force pushing against her. The room was at the very end. It was small. It was cold. The air was still. It held a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress, a washstand with a ceramic pitcher and bowl, and a single, straight-backed chair. It was as clean, as orderly, and as joyless as the rest of the house. Garrett stopped at the doorway. He seemed too large for the small space. He pointed to the small, cold fireplace. "The fire is out." He paused, then looked back down the hall. He walked to the main fireplace, bent down, and picked up a large, dark brick wrapped in a piece of worn flannel. He brought it back to her. "Take this," he said. "It is warm. For the bed." Eliza reached out and took it. The brick was heavy, and its heat soaked through the cloth into her cold hands. It was a solid, practical comfort. It was a gesture made without words, a small anchor. He turned to leave, but paused again. His eyes fell on her thin shawl, damp from the night air. He looked at her, then at her dress, which was not made for the high country cold. He turned, walked a few steps to a peg outside his own room, and took down a heavy wool coat. It was a man's coat, but it was smaller than his. It was dark green, the wool soft and worn. "This was," he started, his voice suddenly rough, as if the words were stones in his throat. "This was Mary's, my wife's." Eliza's hand, the one not holding the brick, went to her own throat. "It is just a coat," he said, his voice softening. "Though the roughness was still there, it is warm. No sense in freezing." He held it out to her. She took it. The wool was heavy and surprisingly soft. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something sweet, like dried flowers. He was not asking her to be Mary. He was just giving her a coat. The brick, the coat, they were acts of nonverbal care, small threads tying her to this strange, sad place. "Get some rest," he said. He turned and walked away, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Eliza stepped into the room and closed the door. She heard his voice down the hall, and his mother's, low and angry. Then she heard his short and final, and then the sound of his own door closing. Silence. Eliza stood in the dark, clutching the warm brick and the soft coat. She was here. She was not kicked out, but she was not, in any way, welcomed. She was an object, a piece of property, balanced between a man's need and a mother's resentment. Who am I in this house? The question was no longer a whisper. It was the only thing she had. She walked to the single, small window. The moon was higher now, and it cast a pale, cold light over the ranch yard. And then she saw it. Beyond the porch, standing skeletal in the moonlight, was a large cottonwood tree. From one of its thick, bare branches, 2 ropes hung down. At the end of them was a single plank of wood, a swing. It was a swing meant for a child. As she watched, the wind, the same persistent, cold wind from the mountains, pushed the empty seat. It moved, back and forth, a slow, lonely, silent arc. The rocking chair inside, the empty swing outside, they were monuments to loss, ghosts that still moved. Eliza stared at the empty, swaying seat. A strange, impossible thought flickered in her mind. It was not a place of sadness. It was a place of emptiness. Waiting, she thought. A place of loss could also be a place of giving. She did not know what the thought meant, but she held it, just as she held the warm brick, as she stood in the cold, silent house. Life on the coal ranch found its rhythm. It was a rhythm of work, not comfort. Eliza rose before the sun. When the air in her small room was so cold it stung her lungs, she would dress in the dark, her fingers clumsy, and put on the heavy green coat that had belonged to Mary. It was too large in the shoulders, but it was warm. It smelled of cedar, and she tried not to think of the woman who had worn it before. She learned the house. She learned the sound of the pump handle, a high, lonely squeak in the pre-dawn chill. She learned the weight of the slop bucket for the hogs, the sharp, ammoniac smell of the chicken coop where she gathered eggs, the gritty feel of the broom sweeping the wide plank floors. And she learned Eleanor Cole. Garrett's mother was a shadow that ruled the house. She spoke little, but her silence was a constant measurement. Eliza felt her eyes on her back as she kneaded dough in the kitchen. She felt her disapproval when a plate was set down too loudly. Eleanor moved through her home with a fierce, brittle energy, scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, her lips set in a permanent line of dissatisfaction. She was the guardian of a past that Eliza had interrupted, the high priestess of the bloodline Eliza had failed to provide. Garrett was an absence. He was gone before Eliza lit the kitchen lamp and returned long after dark, his face masked by fatigue and trail dust. He ate his meals quickly and without talk. He would sit for a short time by the low fire, cleaning a piece of harness or checking his ledgers. and then retreat to his own room. He did not speak of the market day. He did not ask Eliza how she fared. He had given her shelter, and in return, she gave him her labor. It was a simple, silent contract. The shame Eliza had carried from Dust Creek did not disappear. It simply settled, a cold stone in her gut. But with every bucket of water she hauled, with every shirt of Garrett's she mended, a new feeling began to grow alongside it. It was resolve. She was not a guest. She was not a wife. She was a worker. She would earn the bread she ate. The empty swing outside her window continued to move in the wind. She watched it every morning. It was a reminder of the loss that defined this ranch. The loss of a son, the loss of an heir. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, she saw them. They were small, shadows flitting near the edge of the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. 2 children, a boy, perhaps 7, and a girl, a year or 2 younger. They were thin, their clothes little more than rags, their hair matted. They were watching the swing, their faces pale and hungry. Eliza knew who they were. They were the children of the territory, the ones who belonged to no one, who survived on the edges of towns like Dust Creek, living on scraps and air. She went to the kitchen door, a piece of leftover cornbread in her hand. She did not call out. She simply stood, holding it. The boy saw her. He grabbed his sister's hand, ready to bolt. Eliza did not move. She placed the bread on the porch step and backed away, leaving the door open as she returned to the kitchen. A minute later, when she looked again, the bread was gone. The next day, they were back. This time, Eliza brought out 2 pieces. It continued for 3 days. They never came closer. She never spoke. On the 4th day, the wind was sharp, carrying the threat of a late snow. Eliza looked at the children, huddled behind the trunk of the great tree. She thought of the empty, dusty space behind the main barn. It had once been a stable, but Garrett kept his mainstring in the larger building now. She took the bread and walked outside. The children vanished. She went to the old stable. The door hinges screamed when she pulled it open. The air inside was thick with the smell of old hay, dust, and mice, but it was out of the wind. She swept a space clean on the hard-packed dirt floor. She found 2 overturned wooden crates and set them upright. She went to the house, took a tin cup, and scraped a small pile of cold ash from the hearth. She returned to the stable and waited. It took an hour. The boy's head peeked around the doorframe. "It is warm in here," Eliza said, her voice quiet. "You can eat inside." He stared at her, his eyes wide, weighing the risk. His sister hid behind him. Finally, shivering, he pulled the girl and darted inside, snatching the bread. They huddled on the far wall, as far from her as they could get. Eliza did not watch them eat. She turned to the clean patch of floor. With her finger, she dipped into the cup of ash. Slowly, she drew a large letter in the dust, an A. The children ate, their eyes fixed on her. She drew a B, then a C. The girl, her hunger satisfied, crept a foot closer. Eliza pretended not to notice. She kept drawing. She spoke the name of each letter to the empty room. B, C. The next day, they were waiting by the stable door. The day after that, the boy brought a friend, another thin boy with no shoes. By the end of the week, there were 5. They sat on overturned buckets and wooden crates. Eliza, with no slate, used the floor. With no chalk, she used ash. She had no books, so she told them stories. She told them a story her own mother had told her about a wild stallion that could not be caught. She gave the horse a name and a voice. And for the first time, a sound was heard in the cold. Clear air of the coal ranch that was not the wind or the creak of the empty swing. It was laughter, thin, high-pitched, and cautious. But it was laughter. It filled the empty stable, the place where animals had been tied. Now, it was a place where words were being tied, where a new kind of life was beginning. Eleanor Cole heard it. She stood on the back porch, her hands wrapped in her apron, her face a mask of iron disapproval. When Eliza returned to the kitchen, the older woman was there, her eyes like chips of ice. "You are bringing vermin to this property," she said. "They are just children, Mother Cole." Eliza's voice was low. "They are strays. They carry disease. They do not belong here." "They are hungry," Eliza said, "and they are cold. That is not our concern. This is a ranch, not an orphanage. This is a decent house." Eleanor's gaze was sharp, pointed. "It is not a place for that. The word hung in the air, meaning the children, meaning Eliza, meaning everything that was not pure, not of the bloodline. Eliza said nothing. She was braced for the confrontation, for Garrett to come home and tell her to stop. She was his property. In a way, she was here on his terms. She waited all evening for the verdict. Garrett came home. He ate his supper. He said nothing. He said nothing the next day or the day after. A week later, Eliza was standing by the stable door, waiting for the children. She heard the rumble of Garrett's heavy wagon returning from town. It was early for him. The wagon pulled into the yard, and he stopped it near the porch. Eliza watched as he climbed down. He walked to the back of the wagon, and he lifted out the two orphan siblings, the first two, the boy and the girl. He had found them on the road, halfway to Dust Creek, and brought them back. He set them on the ground. He looked at Eliza, a long, steady look across the yard. He did not smile. He did not speak, but his message was clear. It was his blessing. It was his support. He turned, unhitched the team, and led them to the barn, his work for the day not yet done. That evening, the house felt different. It was still silent, but the silence had shifted. Eliza, emboldened by his silent act, was trying to make a second loaf of bread for the children. She was distracted, her mind on the story she would tell them tomorrow, her heart full of a strange, fragile warmth. She smelled it too late. She grabbed a rag and pulled the heavy iron pan from the oven. A cloud of acrid black smoke billowed up, stinging her eyes. The bread, both loaves, were ruined. They were charred, black bricks. Tears of frustration sprang to her eyes. Flour was precious. It was a waste. It was a failure. "Good heavens!" Eleanor's voice, sharp from the doorway. "First you burn the daylight. Now you burn the bread. What did he even pay for you?" Eliza flinched, turning, her hand wrapped in the thin rag, still on the hot pan. She was braced for the anger, for the scolding. The front door opened. Garrett stepped in, bringing the cold night air with him. He stopped, his gaze taking in the scene, the smoke, his mother's rigid posture, Eliza's face, pale with fear and streaked with soot. His eyes fell to the blackened loaves. He walked past his mother. He went to Eliza. He did not look at the bread. He looked at her hand, still clutching the pan. "Let go," he said, his voice quiet. She released her grip. He gently took the pan from her and set it on the cold stone of the hearth. He looked at her empty hands, red from the heat. Then he looked at the bread. He picked up one of the black bricks. It was heavy, useless. He looked at his mother. "Burnt bread," he said, his voice level, "is better than a burnt person." He broke the loaf in two, the inside still gummy and raw. It was a total loss. He dropped the pieces back in the pan. He looked at Eliza. "Your hands are red," he said. "Put some lard on them." It was not a compliment. It was not kindness. It was a simple observation, a statement of fact. But to Eliza, it was a shield. He had not blamed her. He had seen her, not the failure. He had chosen her side. It was a healing balm, more powerful than any lard. Eleanor Cole said nothing. She turned, her back a stiff rod of fury, and disappeared into her room. The confrontation, however, was only delayed. The school grew. The 5 children became 7. The whispers from town had reached the ranch. Garrett heard them when he went for feed. Cole's barren woman, teaching strays because she cannot have her own. The rumor twisted her act of kindness into a mockery of her failure. It made Eleanor's resentment harder, colder. One evening, as Eliza was cleaning the kitchen, her mother-in-law stood by the cold fireplace, her hands twisting in her apron. "This house," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with a suppressed rage. "It used to be full of children's laughter, real laughter, from a real child, my grandson." It was the second knife. The first had been a cut. This was a deep, twisting wound. She was accusing Eliza of filling a sacred, empty space with something profane, something worthless. She was saying these children were not real, that Eliza was not real. Eliza looked at the older woman. She saw the raw, gaping grief behind the anger, the pain of a woman who had lost her lineage. Eliza's first instinct, the one beaten into her by her father, by her first husband, was to apologize, to shrink, to make herself small. But she did not. She thought of the burnt bread. She thought of Garrett lifting the children from the wagon. Slowly, Eliza put down the dish rag. She dried her hands. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply stood up straight, looked Eleanor Cole in the eye for one long, silent moment, and then walked out of the kitchen. She walked out the front door, pulling Mary's coat on as she went. She did not know where she was going. She just walked. She walked past the barn, past the silent, watching stable, and up the low hill that rose behind the house. The wind was strong up there. It whipped her hair from its pins and tore at the coat. It felt clean. It felt honest. She stood there, watching the last of the sun bleed red over the dark mountains. She had not argued. She had not cowered. She had simply left. She had stood her ground by walking away. She heard his boots on the rocky soil before she saw him. Garrett came up the hill. He did not walk to her, but stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his hat pulled low. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the dark swallow the land. "It is cold up here," he said finally. "Yes," she whispered. He did not apologize for his mother. He did not mention the kitchen or the children. He accepted the world as it was. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled something out. It was small and pale in the twilight. "My wife, Mary," he said, his voice rough. "She loved this hill. She lost her first comb up here. I bought her this one in Cheyenne to replace it." He held it out. It was a comb, a beautiful, heavy comb made of ivory, carved with small flowers. It was an intimate thing, a personal thing. Eliza's hand flew to her own, rough, wind-tangled hair. She shook her head, taking a step back. "I cannot, Garrett, I cannot. I am not her." He stopped her, his voice firm, cutting through the wind. "I know you are not." He stepped closer, and his eyes met hers. She saw the depth of his own loss, his own pain, but she also saw something else. Trust. "Do not be her," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Be Eliza." He pushed the comb into her cold hand. His fingers, calloused and warm, closed around hers for a brief second. "Be Eliza," he repeated. He turned and walked back down the hill, leaving her alone with the wind and the ivory comb. Eliza stood there, the heavy, smooth ivory in her palm. It was a token, a promise. He was not asking her to replace his dead wife. He was asking her to be herself. It was the strangest, most powerful compliment she had ever received. She did not put the comb in her hair. Not yet. But as she walked back to the house, she held it tight. When she passed the living room, she saw him at his desk. He was not cleaning harness. He was looking at a stack of papers, land deeds, a letter from the territorial office, bearing an official seal. He was frowning, his brow furrowed in the lamplight. He was a man who respected paper. He respected deeds and contracts. And Eliza, she knew, had neither. The town respected property. She was not property, and she was not family. She was something in between. And the world, she was beginning to understand, did not like things in between. The hook was set. The ivory comb was heavy in her hand. Eliza kept it wrapped in her one spare piece of linen, tucked inside the small bundle of clothes she had brought from her father's wagon. She did not wear it. It was too beautiful, too intimate. It belonged to Mary, the ghost who owned the green coat and the empty rocking chair. But she held it sometimes, in the cold darkness of her room before dawn, feeling the smooth, carved flowers. Be Eliza. His words were a puzzle she could not solve. She did not know who Eliza was. The school in the old stable became her answer. She was the woman who taught the children. The 7 of them, 3 more having joined, were her purpose. They were the first people in her life who looked at her without seeing a failure. They saw only the woman who told stories about a wild horse and who showed them the magic of turning ash into letters. This fragile piece, however, was built on the property of a man who lived in the world, and the world was coming. Garrett had to go to Dust Creek for supplies, a trip he had put off. He was gone for 2 days. When he returned, the wagon was loaded high, but the set of his jaw was hard. He was silent, but his silence was different. It was angry. Eliza learned why 4 days later. She had gone into town with him. It was a rare trip, only her second time seeing the muddy streets since the day she had been sold. She needed thread, and Garrett needed to speak to the blacksmith. He left her at the general store, telling her he would be back in an hour. The bell above the store door announced her. The store was warm, smelling of ground coffee, cured tobacco, and new bolts of calico. Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith's wife, was at the counter. When she saw Eliza, her hand stilled on a spool of ribbon. The conversation she was having with another woman, a rancher's wife from the South Range, stopped. The silence was a physical thing, as heavy as a blanket. Eliza kept her eyes down. She felt the heat rising in her face. She walked to the back, to the barrels of flour and beans. She needed nothing there, but she needed to be away from the counter. Then the whispering started. It was not quiet. It was meant to be heard. "That is her, Mrs." Gable said, her voice a carrying rasp. "Cole's woman." "She looks thin," the other woman replied, her voice full of a false pity. "Worn out, but I suppose he works her hard." "It is not work that wears her out, Mrs." Gable said, and Eliza heard the smirk in her tone. "It is the school. My Henry told me. She has taken in all the strays, the half-wits and the orphans from the creek, has them in the barn, like a litter of pups." "Good heavens, why?" "Well," Mrs. Gable's voice dropped, but was still clear. "What else is she for? You know she is barren, sent back from the east for it, barren as a stone. I suppose if you cannot have your own, you collect others. It is pitiful, really." Eliza froze, her hand halfway to a sack of beans. The words hit her, each one a small, sharp stone. Barren as a stone. Pitiful. They were mocking her. They were twisting the one clean thing she had, the school, into another symptom of her failure. She turned. She could not breathe the dusty air. She walked quickly, her boots loud on the wooden floor. She fled the store, the bell jangling wildly behind her. She stood on the boardwalk, gulping the cold air, her hands shaking. Garrett was there, walking back from the smithy. He saw her face, the pale shock, the way she was breathing. He knew, instantly. He had heard the same whispers for 2 days. He did not speak. He wordlessly took her arm, his grip firm, and led her to the wagon. He helped her up onto the bench, his movements angry and precise. He drove them out of Dust Creek, the wagon rattling hard over the ruts. The rumors traveled faster than the wagon. The next morning, Eliza went to the stable. She waited. The air was cold. The patch of sunlight on the dirt floor empty. No one came. She waited an hour. She told herself they were late, that the weather was turning. She returned to the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in. The next day, she went again. She brought an extra piece of bread. She sat on her own crate, her hands clasped, and stared at the empty seats. The ash letters on the floor looked like meaningless, childish scrawls. The laughter was gone. The wind blowing through the cracks in the barn walls sounded like whispering. On the third day, she stood by the porch, wrapped in Mary's coat, and just watched the empty path. The pain was a sharp, physical ache. The town had taken her children. They had judged her, and they had found a way to wound her, to take the one thing she had built. She did not cry. Crying was a luxury. She just stood there, absorbing the loss, letting it become part of the cold stone in her gut. She could not stay in the house. Eleanor's presence, her silent, vindicated disapproval, was too much. Eliza walked. She did not know where she was going. She followed the creek, away from the ranch, away from the town. She walked until she came to the small wooden bridge that crossed the low water. 2 miles from the house, a man was sitting there, leaning against the railing, a brown bottle in his hand. She recognized him. He was one of the men who had laughed in the market, a man named Slats, who sometimes worked for other ranchers and drank his pay. He saw her and grinned, his teeth stained. He stood up, blocking her path on the narrow bridge. "Well, well," he slurred, his voice thick. "Look here, it is the little school teacher. Where are all your little brats?" "Ma'am." Eliza tried to step around him. "Excuse me." He moved with her, blocking her again. The smell of cheap whiskey rolled off him, sour and foul. "What is the matter? Too good to talk to me now that you are living in Cole's big house?" He gestured with the bottle, splashing some of the liquid on the planks. "Please, let me pass." "I hear," he said, stepping closer, "that you are just collecting them children, because you are empty, a dry well. Is that true, girl?" He reached out and grabbed her sleeve, his fingers biting into her arm. "A man pays for a woman. He expects returns. Cole must be a damn fool. Or maybe he just likes you for—" "Let go of me." Her voice was a thin, shaking reed. "Or maybe you should not be so proud," Slats sneered, pulling her closer. "A barren woman cannot be choosy." The sound of a horse, fast, cut the air. Hoofbeats, heavy on the dirt road. Garrett pulled his stallion up hard, just feet from the bridge. The horse danced, its eyes wild. He was off the horse before it even stopped. Slats let go of Eliza's arm. Stumbling back, he had not heard the approach. Just talking to the lady. "Cole, no harm." Garrett ignored him. His eyes were not on Slats. They were on Eliza. He walked past the drunk man as if he were not there. He walked straight to Eliza, his face a mask of cold fury. He did not ask what happened. He did not yell. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping her face, her eyes. He saw the tear in the shoulder of her coat. He gently took her arm, the one Slats had grabbed, and looked at it. "Did he hurt you?" His voice was a low growl. Eliza was shaking, but she met his eyes. "No, I am not hurt." "Go to the house," he said. It was not a request. "Garrett." "Go, now!" She did not argue. She hurried past him, past the horse, and began the walk back, her legs unsteady. She did not look back. She did not need to. She heard Garrett's voice, flat and deadly, with no trace of the gentle roughness she knew. "Slats." "Now, Cole, I did not mean—" "You will not touch her again. You will not speak to her again. You will not look at her again. If I see you on this side of the creek, I will break you. Do you understand me?" Eliza kept walking. She heard no reply, only the sound of a man scrambling away through the brush. A moment later, she heard the steady sound of Garrett's horse walking behind her, keeping pace, a silent guardian all the way back to the house. That night, the quiet was deeper than usual. Eleanor had gone to her room early, sensing the storm in her son. Eliza sat in the main room by the low fire, mending the tear in Mary's coat. The needle shook in her hand. Garrett stood by the window, staring out at the dark. The rain had begun. A cold, steady, soaking rain that drummed on the roof. "They are fools," he said to the glass. Eliza stitched, her head down. "They stopped the children from coming." "They are afraid," he said, turning. Afraid of me, her voice was small. "They are afraid of what they do not understand." He walked closer to the fire, the light playing on his hard features. "They understand a woman who bears sons. They understand a woman who runs a house. They do not understand this." He made a gesture that took in her, the house, the empty rocking chair. "They are small people." He knelt by the fire, adding a log. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "But you understand," he said. Eliza looked up, the needle poised. "You understand what I need?" It was the echo, the words from the market. "I don't need children, I need you." He was not just comforting her. He was reminding her of their contract, their alliance. He was telling her that her value was not set by the whispers of Mrs. Gable or the threats of slats. It was set by him, by his need. It was a strange and powerful anchor. "It is still true," he said, as if answering her unspoken question. The rain fell for a week. The world turned to a gray soup of mud and sky. The dirt floor of the old stable became a slick, cold mire. Even if the children returned, it was no place for a school. The idleness ate at Eliza. She could not just cook and clean. She could not just be the woman Eleanor Cole stared at. She needed the work. Behind the barn, attached to the smokehouse, was an old shed. It had once been a storage room, or perhaps a small workshop. It was full of broken tools, rotted harnesses, and forgotten junk. But it had a solid door, a roof that only leaked in one corner, and a plank wood floor. She set to work. She was not just cleaning. She was claiming. She hauled out buckets of rust and rotted leather. She scrubbed the floors. She found old jars and cleaned them. She was covered in dirt and cobwebs, and she had never felt more solid. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window, her disapproval a silent, cold rain against the glass. Garrett watched, too. He said nothing. But one afternoon, he appeared at the door of the shed. Eliza was struggling with a heavy, broken plowshare, trying to drag it outside. He did not ask what she was doing. He simply bent down, lifted the massive piece of iron, and carried it out into the rain. He did not speak. He just helped. In the back corner of the shed, under a pile of stiff, mildewed canvas, she found a small leather trunk. It was not locked. She opened it. Inside, protected from the damp, were papers, and beneath them, a heavy, leather-bound book. It was not a Bible. It was a ledger, the Cole family record. Her hands, rough and dirty, trembled as she opened it. The ink was faded brown, page after page of names, a history of blood. Josiah Cole, born 1812, wed to Esther, son, Thomas, born. She turned the pages, her heart beating a slow, heavy drum. She felt like a spy, a trespasser. She found the page. Garrett Cole, born 1843, wed to Mary Evans, 1872. And below it, William Cole, born 1874. And then, in the same hand, William Cole, died 1876, fever. And just below that, Mary Cole, died 1876, fever. The two losses, one after the other, a hammer blow. The house's silence suddenly made a terrible, perfect sense. Eliza's hand shook, and she almost closed the book, but she saw one more line, written at the bottom of the page. The handwriting was different. It was spikier, angrier. Eleanor's hand, awaiting new seed for the line. But the line, that desperate, hopeful plea, had been violently crossed out. A thick, black line of ink, drawn through the words, again and again. An act of rage. The hope was dead. The line was broken. Eliza stared at the black, angry mark. This was the grief that ruled the house. This was the ghost she was fighting. She turned to the next page. It was blank, empty, waiting. Her fingers felt the urge, a sudden, powerful impulse, to take a pen, to write her own name, Eliza May, here, to declare her own existence in the Book of Coal. But she could not. She did not belong. She had no right. She was not blood. She was not a wife. She was the woman who had been bought. She closed the book, her heart aching. She gently placed it back in the trunk and covered it with the canvas. The rain stopped the next day. The air was washed clean, and the sky was a high, pale blue. Eliza looked out the kitchen window and saw Garrett in the side yard, the place that caught the morning sun. He was digging. He had 3 sticks in the ground. No, not sticks. Trees. 3 small, bare saplings. She pulled on the green coat and went outside. The ground was soft and wet. "What are you doing?" she asked. He did not look up, tamping the dark, rich mud around the base of the first sapling. "Planting. It seems late for planting." "Pears," he said. He moved to the second tree. "This one, and this one, and this one. 3. "They are so small," she said. "They will take years to bear fruit." Garrett straightened up. He looked at the 3 small, hopeful sticks. His hands were covered in the black mud of his land. "That," he said, his voice quiet, "is the point." He was planting for a future. He was not waiting for a son. He was planting pear trees. Hope, for him, was a form of labor. Eliza felt a small, strange warmth in her chest. The mail rider came 2 weeks later, his horse kicking up mud. He brought a stack of papers and 1 official letter, sealed from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Garrett took it. He stood on the porch, his mother and Eliza watching from the doorway as he broke the seal. The silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. He read the letter. His face, which had been softened by the planting of the trees, hardened. He read it again. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice sharp. Garrett folded the letter slowly, creasing it with his thumb. He looked at his mother. Then his gaze moved. Finding Eliza, "It is from the land office," he said, his voice flat. "They are confirming the census for the land claim. They require clarification." "Clarification," Eleanor pressed. He looked at the letter, as if the words were a sentence. "They require me to state, for the record, my marital status, and the legal name of all occupants of the household." The unspoken word hung between them, heavy and cold as iron. Wife or servant. The law, the world of paper and ink had come to their door, and it was demanding that Eliza May finally be named. The letter from the Territorial Land Office lay on the kitchen table. It sat there all evening, a white square of paper that felt heavier than an anvil. It was a judgment waiting to be passed. Garrett had placed it there after reading it on the porch. He said nothing more, disappearing to the barn for the evening chores, leaving the document to cast its shadow in the lamplight. Eliza could not look at it. She went about her tasks, preparing the meager evening meal, but her hands fumbled. She dropped a spoon, and the clatter on the floor made her jump. The letter was an accusation. It demanded a name for her: hired hand, servant, occupant, or the one word she knew was a lie wife. Eleanor Cole, however, looked at it often. She sat in her rocking chair, her mending in her lap, but her eyes kept darting to the table. She saw the letter not as a threat, but as a clarification. It was the law, the voice of the outside world. finally coming to restore order to her house. The law would put this strange, barren woman in her proper place. The silence in the house grew thick and suffocating. When Garrett finally came in, he washed his hands at the basin, the sound of the water splashing loud in the tense quiet. He was tracked with mud and smelled of wet hay. He sat at the head of the table. Eliza set the plates down, stew and hardtack. Eleanor stopped her rocking. She placed her mending aside. "Well, Garrett?" Her voice was sharp. Garrett did not look up. He picked up his spoon. "The stew is warm. You must answer the letter." His mother insisted, her patience snapping. "The government requires it. You must tell them the truth." "And what truth is that, Mother?" he asked, his voice low, still not looking at her. "The truth," she said, her voice rising. "That she—" Eleanor nodded toward Eliza, refusing to use her name. "Is a hired hand, a woman you took pity on. You write, Eliza May, servant. That is the law. That is the truth." Eliza froze, her hand on the back of her chair. "Servant," the word was a slap. After the school, after the incident at the bridge, after the comb, she was still just a servant. The shame, which she had fought back, rose hot in her throat. Garrett laid his spoon down. Slowly, he lifted his head. He did not look at his mother. He looked at Eliza. His eyes were clear. He was not angry. He was just watching her, waiting. "Is that what you are, Eliza?" he asked, his voice quiet. Eliza's breath caught. It was a test, a question that held her entire future. His mother stared at her, her eyes demanding one answer. Garrett watched her, his face unreadable, demanding another. She thought of her father selling her. She thought of slats on the bridge. She thought of the whispers in the general store. Barren, pitiful. She thought of the title her first husband had given her failure. Now, Eleanor was giving her a new one servant. She looked at Garrett. She remembered his words on the hill. "Be Eliza." "No," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence of the room. "I am not—" Eleanor Cole let out a sharp, indignant breath. "Then what are you? You are not his wife. You have no ring. You have no ceremony. You stand in Mary's house. You live on my son's charity." "Mother," Garrett said, and the single word was a cold, sharp blade. Eleanor stood, her chair scraping harshly on the floor. Her face was pale with fury. "You would defy the law. You would lie to the territory for her." Garrett said nothing. He just held his mother's gaze until she looked away, defeated by his silence, with a sound of pure disgust. Eleanor turned and left the room, her stiff back disappearing down the dark hallway. They heard her door close, the sound sharp and final. They were alone. The fire in the hearth popped, a small explosion in the heavy quiet. The letters still lay between them. Eliza's hands were shaking. She had defied his mother. She had spoken out of turn. She had no legal standing. He could send her away. He had paid $50 for her, but he could discard her just as easily. Garrett watched her. He saw her fear. He pushed his own plate away. "We do not need a piece of paper to tell us what this house is," he said, his voice soft, the roughness back in it. "We do not need a name for the law to know we are a home." Eliza looked down at the table, at the whorls in the wood. "But the law requires a name." "Yes," he said, "it does." He did not move. He did not tell her what to do. He simply waited. He reached over to the small desk in the corner and pulled the inkwell and the pen toward him. He did not open the ink. He just placed them on the table, next to the letter. He was giving her the pen. He was giving her the choice. Eliza stared at the items. The pen, the ink, the letter. Name of spouse, if any and all other occupants. She could write servant. It would be a lie, but it would be a safe lie. It would appease his mother. It would satisfy the law. She could write wife. It would be a bigger lie. A fraud. A wife was a woman who came with a promise, a ceremony. A wife was a woman who could provide what the Cole family record demanded, awaiting new seed for the line. She was barren. To write wife would be to claim a title she had failed, a title she had no right to. It would be a betrayal of him, and of Mary. Be Eliza. What was she? She was the woman he needed. He had said so. She was the woman who had built a school from ash. She was the woman who had faced down his mother's grief. She was the woman who had mended his dead wife's coat. He had planted pear trees. Hope, for him, was labor. She had cleaned the shed. Her claim, too, was labor. Her hand, slow and trembling, reached out. She did not look at him. She picked up the pen. She uncapped the inkwell. The dark, chemical smell filled her nose. She dipped the nib. A drop of black ink hung from the point. She pulled the letter closer. She smoothed the paper. She looked at the blank line. Her hand moved. The scratch of the nib on the paper was the only sound in the world. She did not write wife. She did not write servant. She wrote Eliza May. And on the line beside it, for her status, she wrote 2 words. Homestead partner. She paused, the pen hovering. It was not enough. It needed the reason. She added 2 more words, the ones that mattered, the ones that separated her from blood, from law, from shame. By choice. She put the pen down. Her hand was no longer shaking. A profound, deep calm settled over her. She had, for the first time in her life, named herself. She looked up at Garrett. He had been watching the fire, giving her the dignity of her privacy. Now, he turned his head and looked. He leaned forward, reading her small, clear script. Eliza May, homestead partner, by choice. He read the words twice. He looked at her, and his face was open in a way she had never seen. The sadness was still there, but it was joined by something else. Respect. A deep, profound respect. He nodded. Once, a short, sharp dip of his chin. He took the paper, folded it carefully, and slid it into his shirt pocket, the one over his heart. I will ride to town tomorrow, he said. I will file this. The next morning, Eliza awoke before dawn. She felt a lightness she had never known. The shame, the cold stone she had carried for so long, was not gone. But it had shifted. It no longer sat in the center of her. She went to the kitchen. The letter was gone from the table. Garrett was also gone. She looked out the window. His stallion was missing from the corral. A cold dart of panic shot through her. Had he changed his mind? Had he read her words in the cold light of day and seen them as foolish, as presumptuous? Had he ridden to town to scratch out her name and write servant? Eleanor Cole entered the kitchen, her face a pale, stern mask. She, too, saw the empty table and the missing horse. A small, cold smile touched her lips. She said nothing, but her look was triumphant. She was certain her son had come to his senses. He has gone to handle his business, Eleanor said, pouring herself coffee. As a man should. Eliza did not reply. The dread returned, heavy and cold. She spent the day in a fog, waiting. Every task was a torment. The kitchen, which last night had felt like hers, now felt like a prison. She was a fool, a child who had played at being a woman. She heard his horse in the yard in the late afternoon. She was standing by the stove, her hands twisted in her apron, her heart hammering. He did not come in the front door. He used the back door, the one that opened into the kitchen. He stamped the mud from his boots. He was carrying something, a flat, square object wrapped in a piece of burlap. He saw her, and he saw his mother, who had stopped her rocking, waiting for the verdict. Garrett walked to the table. He unwrapped the package. It was a simple frame, made of dark, polished pine. Inside it, under a piece of glass, was not the original letter. It was a fresh, clean copy of the official homestead filing, the one he had just registered with the land agent in Dust Creek. And on it, in his own strong, clear hand, he had filled in every line. Head of household Garrett Cole, occupants Eleanor Cole mother. And at the bottom, the final declaration. Homestead partner Eliza May by choice. He had taken her words and made them law. He had filed them with the territory. Eleanor let out a small, strangled gasp. Garrett turned from the table. He had a hammer in his other hand. He walked to the wall by the hearth, the wall that every visitor to the house would see, the wall where Mary's portrait might have hung. He took a nail from his pocket. He placed it against the log. He lifted the hammer. The sound, sharp and clear, rang through the house. Tap, tap, thud. He hung the frame. It was a statement. It was a vow. It was, in the language of Dust Creek, a wedding certificate. The kitchen was their church. The shared labor was their vow. The frame was their ring. Eliza stared at it, her name on the wall. Eliza May. She felt the last of the shame break apart and fall away. She was not a ghost. She was not a replacement. She was not a servant. She was Eliza. Eleanor Cole was pale, her lips moving without sound. She stared at the wall, at the framed document that publicly and legally defied her entire world. The ice did not just crack, it shattered. She said nothing. She looked old and frail. She turned, walked to her room, and closed the door. Garrett put the hammer back in its drawer. He turned and looked at Eliza. The kitchen was dim, the fire low. He did not smile. He did not touch her. He simply looked at her, his partner. "It is done," he said. Eliza nodded. She took a breath, the first truly deep breath she had taken in a year. She walked to the stove. She picked up the heavy iron skillet. The handle was cold. She felt its weight, its purpose. "I will start supper," she said. Her voice was new. It was the voice of the woman of the house. The document on the kitchen wall had changed the air in the house. It was a silent, unmoving declaration. Eliza May, homestead partner. By choice. It was not a marriage license, but it was a fact, as solid as the pine frame that held it. Eleanor Cole was a ghost in her own home. She still sat in her rocking chair, but her silence was no longer a weapon. It was a retreat. She spoke only when necessary, her eyes avoiding the framed paper as if it were a hot brand. She had not been defeated by an argument, but by a simple, framed statement of fact. The greatest change, however, was not in the house. It was in the old stable. The children had returned. Word of the document, filed and recorded by the land agent in Dust Creek, had traveled on the wind. It was a piece of legal paper, and the territory, for all its wildness, respected paper. The whispers in the general store had changed. Eliza was no longer just Cole's barren woman. She was Cole's partner. The word had weight. One by one, the children had reappeared, their faces sheepish, their hunger overriding their parents' fear. First the 2 orphans, then the shoeless boy, and finally, all 7. Eliza had moved them from the damp old stable to the new shed she had cleaned, the one with the wooden floor. She had scrubbed it clean, and Garrett, without a word, had built them a rough table and 2 long benches. She was teaching them to read, using an old almanac, when she heard the sound. It was not a sound that belonged on the ranch. It was not the rumble of a farm wagon or the jingle of harness. It was a high, thin, rattling sound. The sound of light wheels moving too fast, of springs complaining. Eliza looked out the open door of the shed. A carriage was pulling up to the main gate. It was not a buckboard. It was a black, enclosed carriage, the kind she had not seen since she left the East. The oilcloth sides were shiny, catching the pale sun. The wheels were polished. A man she did not know, wearing a driver's cap, sat high on the seat. It was a piece of another world, dropped into the mud and grit of the coal ranch. The driver set the brake. A man stepped out. Eliza's breath left her. The almanac slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. He was wearing a dark wool suit, a white shirt, and a string tie. His boots were polished, and he stepped gingerly into the yard, his face showing clear distaste for the mud. He was clean. He was civilized. He looked tired, his eyes dark and circled. It was Henry, her husband. The children in the shed went silent, sensing the stillness in her. Henry did not look at the main house. He had seen her in the shed doorway. He began to walk toward her, his polished boots sinking into the soft ground. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze taking in her rough spun dress, the man's coat she wore, the dirt on her hands. "Eliza," he said. His voice was just as she remembered it, soft, educated, and always slightly surprised. He looked past her, at the 7 small, dirty faces of the children huddled inside. What is this? What is this place?" Eliza found her voice. It was not the thin, frightened voice he knew. It was the voice that had named herself on a government form. "This is my school. What are you doing here?" "Henry." He seemed taken aback by her tone. This was not the broken, weeping woman he had put on a stagecoach and sent home to her father. "I have been looking for you," he said, "for months. Your father, he would not tell me where you had gone, only that he had made arrangements." He looked around, at the bare trees, the imposing dark log house, the muddy corral. "This is the arrangement." "You did not answer my question," Eliza said. She did not move. She was a barrier between him and the shed. Henry looked uncomfortable. He had rehearsed this. He reached into the inner pocket of his fine suit coat. He pulled out a small bag. It was not a rough cloth bag full of coins. It was dark velvet, closed with a silk cord. It was heavy. "Eliza, I have come to—" he faltered, the words catching in his throat. "I have come to apologize and to ask you to come home." He held out the velvet bag. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming in a rush. "I was a fool, a cruel fool. This is for your trouble, for your father." Eliza looked at the bag. She looked at his pale, tired face. Home. The word felt strange, like a language she had forgotten. "The home you sent me from, the home you told me I had failed." Pain, real and sharp, crossed his face. "Please, do not. It is— Things are different now. Everything is different." "What is different, Henry?" He looked down, unable to meet her steady gaze. "Abigail, my wife, she passed away 6 months ago. The fever—" Eliza said nothing. She waited. "And that is not all." He took a ragged breath. Before, the doctor, he told me." Henry's voice dropped to a pained whisper. "It was not her. It was not you." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "It was me, Eliza. The doctor said it was me. There will be no children. Not for me, not for anyone I am with." He took a step closer, his boot making a sucking sound in the mud. "I learned, Eliza, I swear to you, I learned. A house full of fine things. It is just an empty box. Blood is not what makes a family. I know that now. The house is empty. I am empty. Please, I am sorry. Come home." He was offering her everything she had once prayed for. An apology, a vindication, a home, a life where she would not be shamed for being barren, because he was the one. Eliza looked at him, and she felt a great, cold stillness. She saw him, a weak man, a man who had needed a woman to blame for his own failing, a man who had broken her rather than face his own truth, a man who had learned his lesson, but had learned it too late. "You are right, Henry," she said, her voice quiet. "Blood does not make a home." Hope flared in his eyes. "Then you will come, you will forgive me." "I waited for those words," Eliza said, her voice as flat and steady as the plains. "I lay awake for a year. praying to hear a man say that I was not a failure, that I was enough. She took a breath, but the man who said them came too late. You came too late. He stared at her, uncomprehending. What, but this place, this is mud and dirt. I am offering you comfort, a fine house. I am your husband, by law. No. The voice came from behind her. It was low, solid, and absolute. Garrett was walking from the main barn, his strides long and even. He was not rushing. He was not angry. He was simply present. He was covered in hay and the honest dirt of his work. He came to a stop, not in front of Eliza, but beside her. He did not look at Henry. He looked at Eliza. He saw her pale face, her steady hands. Then he looked at the man in the fine suit. "You are not her husband," Garrett said. Henry sputtered, his face turning red. "She is my wife by the laws of God and man. I have the papers." "Papers," Garrett said. The word flat. The law in this territory is about what is claimed and what is filed. He took a small step, so he was slightly in front of Eliza. "You discarded her. You sent her away. You broke that paper." His gaze was flat and cold, and it pinned Henry where he stood. Garrett's voice dropped, became quiet, but it held the finality of an axe splitting wood. "She was not returned to you," he said, "each word a stone, so you cannot take her back." Garrett put his hand on Eliza's shoulder. His hand was heavy, calloused, and warm. It was not a gesture of ownership. It was a gesture of fact. It was an anchor, a public statement of the document hanging on the kitchen wall. "She belongs here," he said. From the window of the main house, Eliza could see a shape. Eleanor, watching, from the shed behind her. 7 small faces were peeking around the doorframe. The entire world of the coal ranch was watching this. This was the public test. Henry looked from Garrett's immovable stance to Eliza's face. He saw her standing, not behind the rancher, but beside him. He saw her absolute stillness. She was not his. She was gone. His face, which had been pleading, crumpled. He was defeated. His hand, the one holding the velvet bag, went limp. It opened. The bag, heavy with apology and late regret, slipped from his fingers. It fell. It did not jingle. It did not crash. It landed in the wet mud by his polished boot with a soft, dull, final thud. The money was silent. The apology was silent. The past was over. It was just a velvet stain in the mud. Eliza looked at Garrett's hand on her shoulder. The words from the market town echoed in her head, but they were no longer just his. "I need you." She looked at the shed, at the children. She looked at the 3 small, bare pear saplings near the house. She looked at the man standing beside her. She needed this work, this place, this quiet, solid man. It was a need that went both ways. Henry did not look at the bag in the mud. He could not. He looked at Eliza's face one last time, searching for the woman he had sent away, and finding only a stranger. He turned, his shoulders slumped. He walked back to his fine carriage, his polished boots ruined by the mud he despised. He climbed in, not looking back. The driver, his face impassive, snapped the reins. The carriage wheels spun, throwing a spray of mud, splattering the velvet bag as it lurched forward and disappeared down the road. Garrett and Eliza stood for a long time, watching it go. The wind was picking up, and it was cold. It smelled like ice. Garrett's hand finally dropped from her shoulder. The public moment was over. "He is gone," Eliza said. "Yes," Garrett replied. He turned, his gaze going to the sky. The clouds were low and dark, a heavy, bruised purple. He looked back at the barn. "I have to finish with the team. A storm is coming." He walked away, his heavy boots sure on the ground. Eliza watched him go. She turned and looked at the children, who were now slowly, cautiously, stepping out of the shed. She had faced the law. She had faced her past. She looked up at the sky. The first cold, hard pellet of sleet hit her cheek. Nature was next. The storm did not come. It attacked. It was not rain, but a solid wall of water and wind that hit the house like a physical blow. The world outside the windows dissolved. The road, the barns, the new pear trees, all of it vanished into a screaming, gray chaos. The roof did not just drum. It sang. A high, thin howl as the wind tore at the shingles. The log walls, thick as a man's chest, creaked and groaned. Garrett had spent the afternoon fighting it, securing the livestock in the main barn, roping the heavy doors shut. He came back to the house soaked, his face raw, his eyes dark with a worry that went beyond the storm. "The creek is a torrent," he had said, stripping off his wet coat, brown and wide. "It is over the banks. The bridge is gone." Eliza had looked up from the kitchen table, her hands still. "The doctor." "He is not coming," Garrett said. His voice was flat. "No one is coming." This was the secret they had held, the one that had been growing between them for 11 weeks. It had been a month prior, after a morning where the world had tilted and gone black for Eliza, that he had taken her to Dust Creek. Not to the general store, but to the small office of the old doctor. The doctor had listened to her story, to the word Barren that she whispered in his dusty room. He had poked and prodded, his face confused. And then, after a long silence, he had looked at her, then at Garrett. "Barren," he had snorted, his voice like gravel. "This is the most active case of Barren I have ever seen. You are, by my measure, 11 weeks with child." Eliza had felt the floor drop away. It was not joy. It was a cold, sharp terror. She had finally found her name, partner, and now biology was going to steal it. She would be reduced back to a womb, a vessel. Her value, which she had built on work and choice, would be erased and replaced by the one thing she had been told she was a failure at. She had looked at Garrett, her eyes wide with panic. What did this mean for them? He had seen the fear in her face. He had looked at the doctor, and his voice was steady. "It does not matter." "It does not," the doctor had stammered. "I told her I did not need children," Garrett said, his gaze fixed on Eliza, not the doctor. "I told her I needed her. This changes nothing. This is just a thing that is happening. You are Eliza May, my partner." He had said it in the doctor's office, said it to her, a regrounding of their contract. The baby was not the purpose. It was a consequence. But now the consequence was here, and the doctor was trapped in Dust Creek, and the world was trying to tear the house apart. Eliza stood by the kitchen table, her knuckles white on the wood. The first pain had come an hour ago, a low, gripping clench that had made her gasp. Now, it was a rhythm as relentless as the rain. Eleanor Cole was in the main room, her rocking chair still. She was terrified. She was a woman of bloodlines and tradition, but she had never been a midwife. She was useless, a pale shadow watching from the doorway, her hands twisting in her apron. Garrett came to Eliza. He put his large, warm hands on her shoulders. "I am here," he said. I am afraid," she whispered, as another wave took her, forcing her to lean into the table. "I am not," he said. His voice was low, a rumble against the howl of the storm. "It is just work. Eliza, like the barn, like the school, we will do this work." She cried out as the pain sharpened, a blade of it. She was losing her anchor. She felt herself becoming what she had feared, just a body, a thing happening. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through her panic. She looked up, her face slick with sweat, her hair plastered to her head. "You are not alone," he said. "Breathe with me. Now, breathe." He took a deep, slow breath, and she matched him. He was her anchor. She worked, she breathed, She leaned on him, and she leaned on the solid wood of the table he had built. The hours blurred, the night deepened, but the storm never paused. The kitchen was a small, hot, bright island in a sea of howling darkness. The pain was a fire, burning away everything. Her past, her shame, her name. It was just the fire. "I cannot," she gasped, clinging to his hands. "Garrett, I cannot." "Yes, you can," he said, his voice fierce, his thumbs rubbing the bones in her hands. "You are the woman who crossed that bridge. You are the woman who stood on that hill. You are Eliza." Her eyes, wild, searched the room for something to hold. They found it. On the wall, the frame. Eliza May, homestead partner, by choice. She stared at it. The words seemed to glow in the lamplight. It was her name, the one she had written, the one he had hung. This was not happening to her. This was her choice. This pain was her choice. She gripped the table. She closed her eyes. She was not a victim. She was a partner. "Now, Eliza," she heard his voice, close to her ear. "Now!" She bore down, a scream tearing from her throat, a sound that was not her, a sound as wild as the wind outside. The wind answered. A titanic, deafening crack of thunder shook the house, so violent it rattled the dishes on the shelf. The lamp flickered. The world went silent for a single, terrible second. And into that silence, a new sound. It was not the wind, it was not the rain, it was a cry, thin, furious, and alive. The storm outside roared, but it had lost. The sound of the house had changed. The silence, the grief, the empty rocking chair. The hollow hall, all of it was broken by this one, small, insistent wail. Eliza fell back, sobbing, empty. Garrett was moving. His hands, which she had thought were so rough, now impossibly gentle. He was working, his movements swift. A moment later, he was there, at her side. His face was undone. The lines were gone. He was crying, silent tears running down his rough cheeks into his beard. He was holding a small bundle, wrapped in a clean flour sack. "Eliza," he whispered. He could barely speak. "It is a girl." He placed the bundle in her arms. She was so tired. She looked down. A small, red, furious face, a head covered in dark, wet hair, a perfect, tiny hand. This was not the child of her duty. This was not the heir for the coal line. This was the child of her choice. This was the baby of the woman who was a partner. "Clara," Eliza whispered, the name coming from nowhere. "Her name is Clara." "Clara," Garrett repeated, his voice thick. He touched the baby's cheek with one finger. The storm outside seemed to fade. It was still there, but its rage was gone. It was just rain now, a heavy, cleansing sound, the sound of the world being washed new. In the doorway, a shadow moved. Eleanor. She was wrapped in a heavy wool shawl, her gray hair loose around her shoulders. She was trembling. Her hands were clutched at her chest. Her face was wet. She was staring, not at the baby, but at Eliza and at her son, his arm wrapped around Eliza's shoulders. She was watching them, a complete, unbreachable circle. The bloodline she had worshipped, the tradition she had protected, it was all gone. And in its place was this, a barren woman, a grieving man, and a child born in a storm, a family built from scratch, from choice, from two broken pieces. It was the surrender. It was the acceptance of a new world. She did not speak. She just stood, her face working, and let the silent tears fall. She gave a single, small, shuddering nod. Then she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the hall. Garrett watched her go. He turned back to Eliza. He looked at his partner and at his daughter. He walked to the small desk, the one where the land document had first sat. He pulled open the drawer. He took out the heavy, leather-bound Cole family record. He opened it to the blank page, the one after the record of his loss. He took the pen, the same pen Eliza had used to name herself. He did not write awaiting new seed. He wrote, his hand strong, Eliza May Cole, chosen partner, by choice. And just below it, he dipped the pen again. Clara Cole, born in the storm. He closed the book. He had not just added to the record. He had changed its meaning. It was not a book of blood. It was a book of the heart. He came back and sat on the edge of the cot where they had moved her. He put his hand on Eliza's hair, smoothing it back from her face. He looked at her, and then at the small, sleeping child in her arms. The house was not silent. It was not a tomb. It was not a house of ghosts. There was a child's breath in the room, and it was, in a way he could never have planned. It was theirs. The storm broke just before the sun. The wind, which had screamed for hours like a living thing, died with a final, exhausted sigh. In its place, there was silence, a vast, heavy, and profound quiet. Eliza opened her eyes. The first thing she felt was a deep, bone-weary soreness. The second was the warmth. She was in her own bed, in her small room, not on the kitchen cot. Garrett must have carried her. The thin light of dawn, gray and watery, came through her window. The world outside was not howling. It was dripping. Then she heard it. It was not the wind, or the creak of the house, or the popping of a fire. It was a low, snuffling sound, a small breath taken, then released. Clara. She turned her head, in a wooden cradle that she had not seen before. Pulled up beside her bed, the baby slept. The cradle must have been William's. It was another ghost, another piece of the past, but it was not empty. The door opened. Garrett stood there. He had not slept. His face was gray with exhaustion, covered in a rough stubble, but the lines of grief and tension that had always carved his features were gone. His eyes, fixed on her and the cradle, were soft. He was holding a steaming cup. "You are awake," he said. His voice was a low rasp. "We are alive?" she whispered. "We are—" He walked over and handed her the cup. Hot, sweet, and strong. He looked out her window. The world is still here. She followed his gaze. The sky was torn, clouds moving fast, showing patches of a high, pale, almost green-blue. The air smelled of ozone, wet pine, and the rich, clean smell of scoured earth. The land was soaked, the yard a lake of brown water, but the house had held, and in the side yard, standing in the middle of a muddy pool, were the 3 pear saplings. They were battered, stripped of a few leaves, but they were upright. They had held their ground. The cycle of seasons and of life, broken and violent, was closing. The world was being reborn, and so was the ranch. It took 2 weeks for the land to dry. It took 2 weeks for Eliza to feel the strength return to her legs, for the soreness to fade into a memory. She spent those days in the quiet rhythm of the house, a rhythm now defined by the baby's needs. Eleanor Cole was the biggest change. The storm had broken something in her. The night Clara was born, she had stood in the hallway and watched a new family be forged in fire and water, a family that had no need of her rules or her bloodlines. The iron in her spine had dissolved. She was still quiet, but her silence was no longer an accusation. It was just quiet. She still sat in her rocking chair, but the sharp, angry creak was gone. She rocked, and she watched. One afternoon, as Eliza sat by the fire, nursing Clara, Eleanor rose from her chair. She went to the old wooden chest in the corner, the one that held her own linens. She opened it, the smell of lavender and cedar filling the air. She took something out, a small, soft bundle of dark blue wool. She walked to Eliza. She did not meet her eyes. Her face was stern, as always, but her hands were trembling. "This was William's," she said, her voice dry. "My grandson's. It is old, but it is soft." She held out a small, perfectly knitted shawl. "She will be cold," Eleanor said, her voice cracking on the last word. She did not wait for an answer. She gently, awkwardly, laid the shawl over the sleeping baby, her old, calloused fingers brushing the baby's dark hair. It was not an apology. It was a surrender. It was an act of grace. The grandmother, who had lost her blood heir, was offering a piece of his memory to the new child, the child of choice. "Thank you, Mother Cole," Eliza whispered. Eleanor just nodded, her lips pressed tight, and returned to her chair. The house was different. Any visitor who came in the doctor, who finally made it across the mended bridge and pronounced both mother and child healthy, or a ranch hand coming for pay saw the story of the Cole Ranch displayed like a triptych. On the kitchen wall, the framed homestead partner document hung by the hearth, a statement of law and choice. On the shelf, the heavy Cole family record was no longer hidden, but open, displaying the new names. And through the window, the 3 small pear trees were visible, their new leaf buds, which had survived the storm, glowing green in the sun. The frame, the book, and the trees. They were the 3 pillars of the new household. When she was strong enough, Eliza bundled Clara against her chest in a sling and walked to the schoolhouse. The shed was dry, the wind having cleaned it. She sat on the bench and waited. She did not wait long. She heard them, the familiar sound of small, running feet. The 7 children. They stopped at the doorway, suddenly shy. They had heard, the whole territory had heard. The story of the storm, and the baby, had become a legend in Dust Creek. The Barren woman had survived a hurricane, and a child had been born. But the children were not alone. Standing back near the main fence line were their parents, 4 women, including Mrs. Gable from the general store, and 2 men, their hats in their hands. They looked awkward, ashamed, and deeply curious. They were the community, come to see the truth for themselves. They did not come close. They just stood, and they watched. The oldest boy, the first one she had fed, crept into the shed. He looked at the floor, then at her, then at the small bundle in the sling. "Is that?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "This is Clara," Eliza said. The boy stared, his eyes wide. He had never seen anything so new. He looked up at Eliza, his face, which was usually so hard and hungry, soft with a sudden, fierce understanding. "Mama Eliza," he whispered. The name was spoken. It was not a joke. It was a fact. The other children, filing in, picked it up. "Mama Eliza." Eliza felt the tears hot behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. She smiled at them. "Sit down. We have lost 2 weeks of lessons." They scrambled to their benches. Outside, the small crowd of parents watched. They saw the woman they had called Barren holding her own child and teaching theirs. They saw the woman they had called pitiful surrounded by love. They saw their own rumors turn to ash. Mrs. Gable, her face pale, did not apologize, but she nodded, just once, a sharp, respectful nod. They turned, as a group, and walked away. The war with the town was over. It had not been won with a fight, but with a fact. Life settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm of growth. The house, once so silent, was now full. It was full of the small cries of Clara, the smell of milk and clean linen, the sound of Garrett's boots, and the quiet creak of Eleanor's chair. Garrett began to work on a new project. The shed was too small. He tore down the old, rotten stable, the place of her first secret school, and salvaged the good timber. He began to build. Near the 3 pear trees, he raised a new, solid, 1-room building. It had a real plank floor, a sturdy roof, and 2 large glass windows to catch the light. He built a small desk for Eliza. He built 3 long, smooth benches for the children. He was building the future with his own hands. Eliza, in the evenings, would sit at the kitchen table by the lamplight. She would nurse Clara with one arm and write with the other. In a new ledger, she wrote the names of her students: Thomas, Sarah, Lucas, Mary, Samuel. She wrote their names down, giving them a place to exist on paper. She was building too. The community, shamed into a new understanding, began to correct itself with actions. The blacksmith, the one whose wife had stood at the fence, sent over a small iron stove for the new schoolhouse. Mrs. Gable sent 3 slates and a box of precious chalk. They were apologies, made in the language of the frontier. A wagon came to the gate one afternoon. It was not a fine carriage. It was a broken-down buckboard, pulled by a single, weary horse. Eliza was on the porch, rocking Clara. She saw the man on the seat, and her heart did not stop. It did not ache. It just beat, steady and calm. Tom May. He climbed down from the wagon. He looked old. He was no longer the loud, desperate salesman who had traded his daughter. He was just a tired, broken man. He had heard the news. He had come to see. He stood by the gate, twisting his hat in his hands. He looked at Eliza, the daughter he had sold as worthless. He saw her, clean, healthy, and strong. He saw the baby in her arms, his grandchild. He saw the new schoolhouse being built. He saw the solid, dark log home behind her. He had sold his entire legacy for $50 and a bottle of whiskey. "Eliza," he said. His voice was a dry croak. He could not look her in the eye. She looked at him. She saw her father. She felt nothing, not anger, not hatred, not even pity. She just felt done. The cycle of his shame, which he had tried to put on her, was over. She stood up. She did not invite him in. She went into the kitchen. Eleanor and Garrett were both there, and they stopped, watching. Eliza said nothing. She took a loaf of bread, fresh from the oven, and wrapped it in a clean cloth. She walked back to the porch. She held the bread out to her father. Tom May stared at it. He understood. It was not forgiveness. It was not a welcome. It was a final transaction. She was no longer his. She owed him nothing. He had no claim on her, or her child. This bread was a dismissal. His hand shook as he took it. I see you are well," he muttered. "I am," she said. He nodded, defeated. He turned, climbed back onto his wagon, and drove away. Eliza watched him go until he was a small speck of dust. She cut the last rope to her old life. She was free. That night, the new schoolhouse was finished. Garrett brought a long, smooth plank of pine into the kitchen and set it on the table. The wood glowed, golden in the lamplight. "What is this?" Eliza asked, shifting Clara in her arms. "It is for the school," Garrett said. "It needs a sign, to hang by the new gate." He looked at her, his eyes warm. "It needs words. Your words." Eliza looked at the smooth, blank wood. She thought of the journey. From the market, from Barren, from servant to partner, to mother. She knew exactly what it needed to say. She reached for the small pot of black paint Garrett had brought, and the brush. She knew the words that would tell their story. Eliza held the smooth pine board across her knees. The kitchen was quiet. Clara was asleep in the cradle, a soft, steady breathing that had become the new heartbeat of the house. Garrett sat across from her, oiling a bridle, the smell of the leather and the wax mixing with the scent of the fire. She dipped the small brush into the pot of black paint. Her hand did not shake. She had taught herself to write on the dirt floor of a barn. Using ash, this was different. This was permanent. She painted the words, not in a fancy Eastern script, but in the same clear, strong, block letters she taught the children. Letters that were meant to be read. Letters that were meant to be believed. Not from blood, from love. She paused, looking at the first line. It was the truth. But it was not the whole truth. It was not the miracle that the storm had brought. She dipped the brush again. And sometimes, love brings life. The next morning, Garrett hung the sign. He did not hang it on the schoolhouse door, but on a high arch he had built over the new gate, facing the road to Dust Creek. It was the first thing anyone who approached the ranch would see. It was the new standard. It was the answer to all the old whispers. It was the thesis of the Cole Ranch. The heavy leather family record. The one Eliza had found in the trunk, the one Garrett had written in during the storm, was no longer a secret. It was not hidden. It was not a source of pain. Garrett did not lock it away. He placed it on the main shelf in the living room, next to the framed homestead document. It was closed. Its purpose served. It was not a ledger of judgment. It was a history, a story of how a family had been made, not from blood, but from choice. The seasons turned. The first winter was hard and deep, the snow piling against the windows. But the house was warm. The kitchen was full of the smell of baking bread. The sound of Clara's small cries was joined by the sound of Garrett's hammer as he built a proper cot for her. In the spring, the 3 small pear trees that had survived the storm burst into a cloud of pale, white blossoms. In the summer, the new schoolhouse was filled with the sound of children reading in unison, their voices clear and confident. By the 3rd autumn, the trees were no longer saplings. They were sturdy, their branches reaching, and they were heavy with the first harvest. The pears were small, green and gold, but they were sweet. Eliza, Garrett, and Clara, now a small girl of 3 with her father's dark eyes, picked the fruit. They filled 3 large baskets. Garrett did not take them to market. He loaded them into the wagon, and he lifted Eliza and Clara onto the bench. They drove to Dust Creek. Eliza walked into the general store, the bell jangling, "Mrs." Gable looked up from the counter. Her face was no longer sharp with gossip. It was a face that had watched and learned. "Mrs. Cole," she said. The name was a simple fact, a title of respect. "Mrs. Gable," Eliza said. She placed one of the heavy baskets on the counter, the first harvest from our orchard. "We wanted to share." "Mrs. Gable looked at the pears. She looked at Eliza. She looked at Garrett, who stood in the doorway, solid and sure. She understood the offering. It was a gift of peace. "We would be honored," she said, her voice quiet. They left the other baskets with the blacksmith and with the families of Eliza's students. They did not come as a barren woman or a grieving widower. They came as a family, as part of the town, giving what they had. They had found their belonging not by asking for it, but by giving. The ranch became an institution. It was a place of work, but it was also a place of learning. They were not married. They wore no rings. The question of their status, which had once been a source of such pain, became a simple fact. A new land agent, a young man from Cheyenne, once rode out to inspect the claim. He was polite, educated, and thoroughly confused. He sat in the kitchen, making notes. He looked at Eleanor, rocking quietly by the fire, a gray and peaceful shadow. He looked at Clara, playing on the floor with wooden blocks. He looked at Eliza, who moved with the easy authority of a woman in her own home. "So, for the territorial record," the young man said, his pen hovering, "your arrangement. You are not legally wed." Garrett did not speak. He was drinking coffee at his table. He simply raised his hand and pointed. The young man turned. He looked at the wall by the hearth. He saw the simple pine frame, the glass gleaming in the firelight. He stood up, walking closer to read the filed, official paper. "Homestead partner Eliza May, by choice." The agent read it. He read it again. He looked at the paper, then at Garrett, then at Eliza. He nodded. A slow, dawning comprehension. He was not in the East. This was the West, where the law was what people made, what they were strong enough to claim and to hold. "I see," he said. He closed his notebook. "My apologies, Mr. Cole, Mrs. Cole." Eliza heard the title, and it did not make her flinch. It did not define her. It was just a sound. She knew who she was. She looked down at her hands. They were not the pale, soft hands of a commodity. They were not the hands of a failure. They were the hands of a partner. They were red and strong, calloused from the garden, the plow, the stove, and the chalk. She had come to this place as a piece of property, valued at $50. She had been defined by what she could not do. But she had learned dignity was not a thing that could be bought, or sold, or given. It was a thing you built. You built it with small, repeated acts. You built it with a clean floor, with a burnt loaf of bread, with a planted tree, with a word written on paper. You built it by choosing to stay. The town of Dust Creek no longer whispered. The people still talked, but they talked of the coal ranch as a landmark. When they had a question about a law, or needed a letter written, they did not go to the saloon. They rode to the schoolhouse. They would stand, hats in their hands, and read the sign on the gate. Not from blood, from love, and sometimes love brings life. They would see the children inside, sitting on the smooth benches, reading aloud. They would see Eliza, her face calm, holding her daughter on her hip as she pointed to a slate. They would see what had been built, and they would be quiet. The justice of the frontier was not just a sheriff's gun or a judge's order. It was the patient, stubborn act of repair. It was the courage to stay, to mend a broken thing, to share a roof, to build a home. The years passed. The snow came again. It fell, soft and thick, covering the fields, silencing the world, piling in deep, clean drifts against the walls of the house. From the outside, the light from the kitchen window was a bright, warm yellow square against the deep, cold blue of the winter twilight. Inside, the house was sealed against the wind. The fire in the hearth was high. Clara, now old enough to read by herself, sat at the big kitchen table, her voice clear and strong as she read a story from an old book. Eleanor, her hair as white as the snow outside, sat in her rocking chair, a heavy quilt over her lap. Her hands, which had once twisted with anger, were still. She was listening. Garrett sat at the other end of the table, mending a thick piece of harness. The leather was dark in his strong hands. Eliza was nearby, darning a small sock. Clara finished her page, her voice proud. Garrett looked up. His eyes, no longer haunted, met Eliza's across the warm lamplight. He did not speak. He did not need to. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a quiet, certain smile that held everything they had built. The market day, the terror of the storm, the sweetness of the first pears, the peace of this room. Eliza looked at him. Her partner, her choice. She smiled back. Outside, the wind howled, but it could not get in. The house had won. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I am so glad you were here to share it with me. I would love to know where you are listening from. So please, drop a comment below and let me know. I love seeing how far these tales travel. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and giving this video a like. And if you really loved it, please press that hype button to help share it with more listeners, so these stories can be heard by as many people as possible. Your support means the world to me.